Hello guys. Should we start or we are missing some visual attendees? I don't see Paul. Is Paul going to join the meeting maybe? Oh, okay. I think we can start. I saw some updates Maru did describing the current prototype he has implemented, challenges faced around it. And there was one open pointer from the last meeting where we thought that we probably be finalizing the finalizing the spec for template substitution output. But I'm not sure if where we actually are converging with respect to the prototype implementation that Maru has right now and the doc that we have, the Quinton has updated.
So I think the intentions of the two are slightly different. The document is intended to capture what we've agreed upon as a reasonable framework for building an implementation and an API specification. And I think the prototype, correct me if I'm wrong, Maru, is mainly to investigate options available and what implementation challenges might arise while implementing. So I don't think we need to necessarily consider the two to be the same thing. I don't think the prototype is intended to be a spec, and I don't think the document is intended to enumerate all the implementation challenges or implementation details. Is that a reasonable statement, Maru?
Mostly. I think that where I would probably differ is that when it comes to making a decision about how we want to architect things, if that hasn't been proven out in prototyping and it's just an exercise in like, I'd like it to be this way, then to me that has less value than I prototyped this and it works. And therefore I know the pros and cons.
Yeah, I just think that it's useful to agree on a proposed way forward, and I have no doubt that we will come across numerous implementation challenges, and we will have to go back and iterate and say, well, we wanted this, but we can't implement it, so we're going to change that. And I think that's totally fine. I don't think we can, implement the whole thing in order to agree on a way forward, which is what I would like us to avoid that. We've been kind of in a bit of a holding pattern for quite some time now. So I think it's time to say this is what we would like the architecture and API to look like, and then refine that if and when we come across problems that we can't resolve with that.
I mean, the sticking point for me is really around template substitution outputs. The suggestion that we're going to be using actual Kubernetes resources. I think I tried to ask clarifying questions about that before, and I guess I didn't ask the right questions. Because I think
I saw your question and I tried to answer it, and I gave it some more thought. So I mean, one concrete example where I can see that actually placing the final per cluster Kubernetes resources in some persistent storage would be useful is in the case of pull propagators. So you can imagine if you have a propagator running in each cluster, which has been proposed as one potential solution, that propagator needs to know what to pull into the cluster. And it would be useful to be able to decouple the scheduling, so deciding which resources need to go into which clusters and what per cluster specializations occur could be implemented in one place, and then the actual propagation into the clusters could be implemented by a pull propagator, and it would be convenient for that pull propagator to be able to read what it's supposed to propagate into its cluster from some well-defined place. So that
was definitely a use case, but I'm sorry, I didn't catch where the pull propagator in this instance would be reading from. Are you suggesting an API, or when you said persistent storage?
Yes, the API.
The Git repo. I guess the assumption I've been running under is that a pull propagator wouldn't necessarily be reading from the API. So if you look at the Fedora document, it may well be reading from a Git repo or some other like persistent storage that doesn't require you to have an API and have it up. Like, it's easier to replicate storage than replicate an API. So if the simplest possible thing, like the representation that a pull propagator needs to read, like if you're trying to make it really simple, I just don't know that.
I think that's fine, but yeah, as you pointed out, the actual stuff that is in wherever that storage is, whether it's GitHub or anything else, in order to have decoupling, in order for one group of people to implement, for example, scheduling and resource substitution, and another group of people to implement the pull propagator, they would need to agree on what that intermediate representation looks like, even if, irrespective of whether it lives in GitHub or in an API server.
Right, but the difference, there's a key difference here. In the case of a Git repo, yeah, I need a canonical representation. In the case of something that's like a push propagator, I don't necessarily need the simplest possible form. I have a controller that can actually create that in memory.
And I think that's explicit in the document, which is that intermediate representation is optional. So if you want to implement a consolidated piece of software, I'll call it, in practice, we usually call these things controllers, that does not emit any of the intermediate stages and has them all in memory like your prototype, that is fine. It just means that, no other propagator will be able to, you won't be able to decouple the propagation piece out of that, or the template substitution, or the scheduling, depending on how you've aggregated these things together. And I think that's fine.
I don't think that's the case. I mean, if you look at the diagram for Fedora, there's kind of two mechanisms potentially for propagation. And you generate a resource representation in combination with placement resources. You can drive push reconciler, but you can just as easily drive YAML generation to a Git repo. So I guess I'll say that I'm not saying that if you want, and Huawei or whoever other interested parties wants to tackle generating Kubernetes resources, like canonical Kubernetes resources into the API, you can do that, but that will not be something we will be pursuing, because in our minds, that's just a lot of extra work. And until we actually have a definitive reason for it, and I haven't heard one, we don't think it's worth it. So,
and that's fine. Yeah, I'm sure there are going to be many cases like this where not everyone agrees, and that's the aim of this exercise, is to agree on whatever the reasonably useful common ground is. But obviously not everybody needs to implement all of this, and alternatives are welcomed and encouraged.
Sure.
Quinton, I would I proposed the same thing in the previous meeting also, that we at least need to converge on, let's call it superset of the federated APIs that we are talking about now. So even if one party or one person does not implement, say, controllers for it, but we still would want to converge on the API spec for that particular resource, which is going to live in the federated API, right?
Yes, I agree. And I think that's where this document is intended, that's the place this document is intended to fulfill. And obviously the document is not sufficient. We need actual code and APIs, and I added explicit wording to the document to say that one of the outputs of this will be API specifications and reference implementations for the procedures mentioned. Not everyone has to use the reference implementations, and there may be multiple reference implementations illustrating different approaches to, for example, what we call procedures or controllers. So that's what we intend to produce based on this document.
Okay. So that sounds okay to you. For example, in your it does, Quinton. So I have confirmation from Maru also. So in your diagram that you have specified, so this particular resource would then be sort of optional. Does that make sense?
Sorry, I'm not. I don't know if you're projecting. I can't see your projection. But which specific resource are you referring to?
I'm referring to the placement, not the placement, the template substitution output, to be exactly naming it. Which Maru is saying is like a temporary stuff which does not persist in.
Yes. So if you implement a combined substitutor and propagator, which I think is what Maru has implemented, for example, and you don't want to enable alternative propagators, for example, then yes, you just don't output the substitution outputs anywhere, or maybe you output them somewhere else, like to GitHub. And I think that is within the spec here.
So when other folks are finished talking, I think there is like a meta point here I want to make, but continue having this combo.
I think I was done, so go for it, Paul.
So I think the part of the confusion that I have perceived around this field is that like so we have a tough problem in terms of communicating around like what the ideas are here, because we are both like fundamentally we're trying to find the right building blocks that give you the tools to make the specific constructions that you want. And it's hard to talk about what those building blocks do without saying, here's a house that we could build with them. And I think that that where the gap around, for example, like the intermediate representation, that's like really that the thing that we've been talking about that is optional is like maybe we could improve the clarity of this document by just drawing lines around like here are like delineating what we think the common building blocks are, and then what things on the diagram are there to illustrate examples. And I feel like we've been talking now about something that is like, that arguably might be an implementation detail of how a particular flavor of propagation is implemented. And I think if that was more clear, we would probably, like the whole thing might be clearer to folks, but I'm not sure if that makes sense. So I'm gonna stop talking. Do people understand what I'm saying?
I struggled a bit to understand what you were saying. Is anyone else in the room unclear on what the diagram and the document means?
I'm not unclear about what it means, Quinton, but I am a little unclear on this exact point that I mentioned a while ago.
So,
That, yep.
I'm
Go
sorry,
ahead.
Irfan. Let me see if I can clarify.
Sure,
So,
sure.
here's the whole picture of what we're trying to enable. Like, here's the big picture. Part of that big picture is building blocks. And the building blocks are like the federated resource, otherwise, placement.
Others can mute, please. No, some noise that I can hear, so I just requested other people to mute. Please.
Oh, okay. And to show the rest of this, like, we have to give, like, here, I'm going to use green for this. Like, to contextualize this, we have to, and like, to illustrate the other parts that, like, we expect to be swapped out. Like, here's propagation. Right, which we expect there to be like at least two fundamental different flavors of, like push and pull. And then there's also like higher level stuff like different flavors of status, scheduler thing, right, etc. And it's what we're describing and what we're talking about and dealing with in this document is the big picture. And I guess what I'm just saying is, like, to really illustrate the big picture, we need to hit on what these things potentially look like. I'm not sure if any of this is visible with the glare in this room. Can anybody see that drawing?
Yeah, I think we get the idea, or certainly I do.
Okay, so like what I'm suggesting is that, like, we can probably just add a paragraph or two to the document that, like, explains this so that people understand that, like, when they're looking at a particular piece of it, like, are they looking at something that we think is a building block with broad appeal versus something that's like an example to illustrate a concept. That's all.
Yeah, I think that makes more sense to me now. I understand you better. I can certainly wordsmith the document some more to give concrete examples of one potential implementation, and maybe we should do two of those, because it seems like there are at least two kind of flavors. There is the flavor that bears stronger resemblance to Federation v1, I guess, where we have active reconcilers and status and all of that, with the change from v1 that we now have these explicit, the explicit decoupling of scheduling, substitution, propagation, etc., with some intermediate representations between them. And then we have, I'll characterize it as Maru's prototype, which is another implementation which uses potentially a subset of the building blocks. And yes, I think it's totally reasonable to add, or perhaps have separate documents. I also don't want this document to get too unwieldy. I think there are, potentially an infinite number of alternative implementations that we could describe, and I don't think they necessarily all belong in this document. And I was actually going to make a comment along those lines. I just noticed before the meeting, sorry, Google's notification mechanism on docs is not ideal in this sense. I only just saw that Maru added a whole few more sections at the bottom of the document. And they come across, and I'd be interested to hear what other people's opinions are, but they sort of, it comes across as quite disjoint from the first half of the document. So terminology used is different, and it's not clear how that part fits with the other part. So I was going to suggest that we move that into a separate document and have a very clear
doing what you asked me to
between the two documents.
You asked me to document Fenord as it relates to this. And this is an example of something that is actually working.
I'm not sure what happened with your sound there.
Yeah, some problem with your voice.
We discussed last week. Can you hear me?
No,
your audio is like really garbled, like loose physical connection on a mic jack or something.
I think I understand what Maru was trying to say, and I'll talk in the meantime while he's sorting out his audio. Yes, I think it is very useful to have documentation of the FNORD prototype. I guess the point I was trying to make is that perhaps having it in this document is not the best place to have it. Maybe a separate document describing FNORD and how it works with a reference, a link from this document saying, here is a description of prototype, etc. Because right now it looks a little, in the first part of the document and the second part of the document are don't logically fit together very well.
That's kind of the point, though. I mean, you asked me last week to update the document with details of Fenord. I mean, I expressed early on when you created this document that while the advanced example made sense, the simple example didn't really match up with what Ivan and I were prototyping with Fenord. And I guess my perception is that code beats up like documentation in terms of like, this is something I've implemented, it actually works. And I'd like to see convergence rather than like trying to derive code out of ideas. If we already have code and it works, let's make sure that we don't throw that away. In the same way that we're not throwing away Federation V1 when we implement this. We're taking ideas and code that work and extending it rather than doing something entirely new with all the risk that entails.
So my question would be, for the parts that don't align exactly, like, is it a question of just vocabulary that was used, or are there actual conceptual mismatches?
I think it's not conceptual mismatches. The mismatches that I observe right now is abstraction levels. So, for example, placement decisions. So there is a mismatch in the sense that the Quinton's document suggests the spec at a higher level of abstraction, and what probably Maru has implemented is the lowermost level of abstraction.
As far as I understand, like what's in Fenord is the implementation of placement decision.
Correct, but it does not meet exactly to what Quinton has specified as a spec of placement decision.
In what way?
I think Maru can explain that better. I said the abstraction level. So the difference is that Quinton's doc says that the implementation is label matcher, whereas the implementation in FNORD is that it's a list of clusters against our resource.
Which, I mean, yeah, and the intention there is if I have, template overrides placement and there's no selectors involved, it's definitive, like it's reproducible. Like I will get the same results when I compute the replica set for a given cluster, regardless of the state of things. And that's kind of intentional. It's leaving the variability to a higher level. And if for some reason that isn't working, you can still derive the exact, like it's deterministic. Given a set of template override placement for a resource, you can deterministically derive the appropriate representation for a cluster versus selector, which it could be variable you don't actually know.
I understand that. I understand. So I was just trying to explain the difference in implementation. I think it's not greatly different. I think the implementation that FNOD has right now is only in terms of levels of abstraction for the API types, if that is acceptable.
Yeah, that particular aspect I don't think is a showstopper. I think we can reconcile those fairly easily. And I must be honest, I only saw Maru's part of the document a few minutes ago, so I haven't really looked at it closely. But it did seem that it was a little like used different terminology at the very least, which made it difficult to understand how it relates to the rest of the document. But let me reread it before I comment further. My question was just, would it make sense to either update the section of the document that describes the simple case such that it is consistent with Maru's thinking, or separate this latter half of the document into a separate one. I understood that to be a prototype to investigate possible challenges, possible implementation approaches, as opposed to being an attempt to develop a specification of what we want.
So my own bias would be towards like I have been looking at FNORD as like the space where we're proving out and finding like gotchas that you're only going to find once you sit down and start implementing these ideas. I think that we should feed back experiences from FNORD into the document and like ensure that and try to make sure that they align. I think that it's might be worth having a discussion once everybody has read the material in this document about, do we need to update the document? And there's two different facets of like potential mismatches. One is just vocabulary. Like I called it frobulator and Daryl called it frobulatrix, right? And they're the same concept. And then there's a more like material difference, which is like, does a mismatch conceptually in an implementation detail level of what's in FNORD versus the rest of the document, like, does that represent that we have like learned something by implementing FNORD that we should feed back into the rest of the document? Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah, it does to me. Yeah. Go ahead, Quillen. Hello.
I'm done. I just said yes. That makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, and what I was trying to add is that, as I said a couple of minutes ago, I don't see a lot of conceptual differences. What I see is differences in terms of abstraction. And for example, the document that Quinton has described, it sort of lays down a spec for example, 5 or 6 different federated resource types. Whereas Maru's implementation is, I'll take it up for the most simplest type and the only needed or necessary resources that might be needed to federate the most simple type in the most simple way. And some of the resources are optional in his implementation, which are not present. So that is where I was saying that do we converge at a spec where we say that we still define the spec for 5 or 6 or 7, which is the superset of all types, all resources, and implementation can choose to use 2 or 3 or 4 or any number. But we still will have to converge at the exact spec of each of them.
Yeah, I think it will probably be most useful if we can agree on the most primitive building blocks and put those into an API group that is shared, so that if one set of parties wants to take those building blocks and build solution X with them, like an opinionated version of status, opinionated higher level constructs around scheduling, opinionated propagation, and some other folks have a different opinion that they want to go and implement, that we need reuse in more than concept, right? Like, we need practical reusable API resources that you really do use as the building blocks. So I think we need to bring those primitives into alignment.
Yeah, I mean, I added to the document, and I think you did as well. It's very clear that the result of this will be a set of API specifications in a Federation v2, let's call it, repository that says these are the API building blocks that we have agreed upon, and here are the API specs. And what's more, we have some reference implementations of things that generate placement decisions, for example, and whatever other things. There are some processes described in the document, and I think it would be useful to have reference implementations of those for two reasons. One being that they will prove out the feasibility of what's described in the API, and two, they will provide useful either directly usable controllers for people who want to actually run those things, or at the very least reference implementations which they can then adapt and change in any ways they want to for their own purposes. Specs without reference implementations are notoriously not useful. So that's my thinking, which I think is in line with your thinking.
Yep. So do we have enough information or familiarity in the remaining 25 minutes to have a discussion about deltas between Nord and the rest of the document? Or is that a conversation for another day?
From what I can see, the lessons learned are usefully documented, and I think it would be useful for people to go through those and comment and or agree or disagree with whatever there's some potential solutions outlined there. I think that's useful. We can debate what we think might be better or worse solutions. As for the actual workflow that is described, that seems to differ mostly in terminology. So it uses, words like replica set template and override, etc., which is different than what's described in the document above. But barring that, I don't, off the top of my head, see any major differences.
Yeah, so I wonder if we might take a pass probably offline so that we don't consume a lot of folks' time and reconcile the specific vocabulary, and then let's try to highlight what the differences are, like in terms of implementation. Maru, maybe you and I can do this, and let's find out what the actual implementation mismatches are, and it seems like that's probably the next step in terms of let's identify where it's just vocabulary, and we'll bring the vocabulary into alignment somehow, and where there's a real delta in implementation, let's hash that out and maybe we can push this effort forward that way. And probably this, like the feedback loop of we've implemented things, let's discuss what implementation choices we made and what those bought for us. This is a feedback loop that we'll have running until we identify what those like primitives are and what the formulations of them are. So this is progress in the sense that like we're going to run the first reconciliation loop, I think. So given that we'll do that offline, there's 22 minutes left in this meeting now. Are there other topics that we want to talk about, or should we just adjourn here?
Yeah, I had one or two other items for discussion. They don't really need too much discussion, I don't think, but I thought I would bring them up briefly anyway. So one is that as a multi-cluster federation, multi-cluster SIG, we need to publish an updated manifest, I think it is called, which just describes, there's basically a template that Phil has produced from the steering committee that says that each SIG should have, a charter saying what its scope is and what its sub-projects are and who the leads are and all these kinds of things. I think we've mostly got that. We just need to plug it into the template and fill in the missing bits. And the reason I raise that is because in order to make use of the new SIGs organization in GitHub and create a repo there, which I think we need to do in order to start publishing these things we're talking about here, it's a prerequisite that we have our SIG in order with this manifest. So I'll bring this up in the meeting. I think it's on Wednesday, the SIG Multicluster meeting. Unless anybody else wants to, I can just put a draft together to do that and circulate it for comment, and then we can hopefully publish that thing in the near future and create the repo and start moving forward.
And this repo is for, sorry, I guess I missed what repo we're talking about.
So we need somewhere to publish our V2 API, the things we've been talking about here. We need somewhere to put the canonical versions of those things. And we also need a place to put the reference implementations of the procedures that we've been speaking about, as well as this document, for example, that we're looking at should go into GitHub, and we can make changes to it with proper revision tracking, etc. So that all has to go somewhere. It can either go in the existing Kubernetes/Federation repo, but I think we agreed at the last meeting, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we should have a new repo with new stuff so we don't have to kind of have a split personality in the old repo. And then at some point in the future, we can decide what we want to do, whether we want to move Federation V2 into Kubernetes/Federation, or where we want to keep it as a standalone repo in the SIGs org in GitHub. But I don't think we need to make that decision yet. We can decide that later. So that's the context.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I wasn't present for the last one, so that I understand where I got out of sync. Okay, I'm happy for, if you're interested in defining that manifest, I'm personally happy not to have to do it.
I think most of the hard work is done. We've already got a vision and goals and SIG leads and a SIG page and all of that stuff. So all I'm going to do is transfer that into the new template that they want and fill in proposals for the missing bits. I think there's like, you need to describe what the working groups are and who the leads of the working groups are and things like that. So I'll just put the draft together, and we can fill in the missing bits as a group. Submit that, finalize it, and then we can say we have a well-formed SIG with a well-formed working group, and we are creating a repo in the SIG's org on the basis of that. So that's sort of the workflow. Cool. I think that's all I have. I don't know if anyone else has anything they want to talk about.
Hi, it's Shashi here. I think there's a couple of minor things. I think I don't know whether I should go ahead. If everybody's free, I think I can discuss that. So one thing is related to the defaulting thing which we found in FNOD prototype, right? So I think I am also interested in how do we tackle the validation. I think similar problem is there with validation too. Like user input some objects which is not valid, and the Federation control plane try to propagate that to the member cluster, and it finds out it is rejected. So it would go on forever rejecting this. So should we use the validation library, or how to bring in this validation to the Federation control plane, so that we can return error as soon as possible to the user? Yeah, I have no idea.
I think the possibility exists for doing test creates resources locally. But I'm not entirely, I don't know. I really don't want to have to copy code.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that.
But presumably we can vendor the code, right?
No, that's
Well,
not.
so there's, I've run in, so just for clarity, I think the specific problem we're discussing is how should we perform validation in like the API group that we're trying to build? How should we do that in the absence of exported code from Kubernetes that is like versioned validations? I will say that I've run into this problem in another area before, which is building a resource called pod preset that TLDR, it basically has a subset of the fields in a pod spec as part of its spec. And when moving this, like we originally built this resource in Kubernetes, it's moving to the service catalog API server. And we hit this problem then of like, once you move it out of Kubernetes, there aren't validations that you can easily consume. So one thing that has been suggested to solve this problem, which we still have to solve in the case of this pod preset thing, is what is to use OpenAPI to do the validation. But I'm not sure if OpenAPI can describe all the validations that are applied to the Kubernetes API.
I think it's a general problem. We just need to ignore it for now. And when we run into particularly egregious problems, we can devise a strategy. But the real challenge is that when we talk about vendoring in code, then we get into the same problem area that Federation v1 has, that we're vendoring a specific version of Kubernetes, or we're vendoring, if you were just to isolate it to the validation code, we'd have to identify, you know, which version of which cluster, and we'd have to have the validation that corresponds to that, and there's always the potential for skew. So I would say we just push it down and we figure out if it becomes a hard enough problem, we'll figure something out, as Paul says, maybe using OpenAPI to describe some of that validation on the kube side so that it can be published by the API server we're targeting. But in terms of, I mean, providing rapid, you know, indication, like failing fast, if I create a federated like a logical federated resource, and then it's going to be propagated to n clusters, there's always the potential of one of the clusters not validating right. And the only way to find out is to propagate to all the clusters that are intended to be propagated to. And I think that to me just speaks of, I mean, the nature of federation is that it is, it's distributed and it's eventually consistent. And we probably have to provide like documentation or education or whatever so that users know that they have to actually monitor things. And when they see certain classes of errors, they'll have to take corrective action or risk their application not working.
Yeah, I think that's a keen point, Maru. I also think that like there isn't a way that we can ensure, like we can't write an insurance policy and say that like even if we had some like really amazing solution to the question of applying the validations, there's no way that we could guarantee that, for example, like we would ensure that when we accepted into the API in the sense of when you made a create, did it perform a create operation against these API groups that, and we accept a resource, that there's no way we can guarantee that there isn't something like a quota in place in one of the clusters that's going to make it so that 100% guaranteed it'll be accepted at the final destination.
Yeah. It's a complicated thing. I think it is. Right now we don't have a clear-cut answer. That's fine, I think.
Yeah, so I think it's worth sitting down and thinking about, because one of the things that I could see being very surprising to users is if you make, for example, like a federated replica set, and then it fails validation in the cluster that you put it in, or one of the clusters or more that you put it in, because users will have a strong expectation probably that things are validated at the time that they're created. So I think there's probably like there's two axes of this, right? Like one of them is that we should find something that is at least a pretty good solution to applying validations, if possible. So principle of least surprise, and then also clearly articulate to users that that they need to monitor their placement status, or whatever the eventual correct channel for information about propagation errors or validation errors that happen when you actually tried to put something into a cluster. Like there needs to be a very clear channel for those, and people need to pay attention to it.
Yeah, that's probably right. But in the first place, why we are doing the federation is to ease some of these issues, to deal with multiple clusters. So if we are giving additional jobs to the user to, okay, we just accepted your object, then you also have to look at other stuff for the status. Maybe we may end up with a complicated state within our system, right? So yeah, I think it's little complicated, but yeah, definitely we need to think into solution. What could be the best, right?
Yeah.
I think it might be, I mean, I always like to think about it as inherent complexity versus accidental complexity. Are we making this harder in ways that it doesn't have to be hard, or are we, we're stuck with the fact that a distributed system with delays in when things happen? That's just kind of the nature of what we're dealing with. And you can paper over it to some degree, but in the end, if the user doesn't have an understanding of what's going on even a basic level, they're kind of in trouble.
Yeah, I agree entirely with you, Maru, and I think quite a bit of what we described here is inherent complexity as opposed to artificially created complexity. Other two brief comments to mention. So I agree with Paul that we need to have a very well-defined way about of how users find out about this stuff. And one fairly obvious possibility would be to have a specific resource type or resource that one watches on and gets events that tell us when things have gone wrong or gone unexpectedly. And the other one is to have the potential for automated, I don't know what the right word is, fixing these things up. So given that things do go wrong, nodes go down, et cetera, do you want the system to fix that as best it can, like we do with Kubernetes replica sets? If I say I want 5 replicas and some of the machines fail at some point, then the system creates new ones for us. And the same principle might apply here, versus the user did something dumb that is never going to work and we need to tell them to go and fix it. And those, I think, are two kind of broad categories of problems that arise.
Yeah, agreed.
I do think it would be very nice if there was so here's something that would make this simpler. I'm not sure if it's like the absolute best thing, but I think it would make this simpler to think about. So for example, if there was a repository that held the Kubernetes validations that you were able to consume without consuming the entirety of Kubernetes. Like you can consume the API types themselves now without consuming all of Kubernetes. That would make this a lot easier. And then we can say, we could say, for example, that like we implement the validations that are pinned, like validations of a specific level of Kubernetes, and allow us to like fix that variable and then say, if you're using, well, one, I think we don't recommend that you use a newer version, or that we wouldn't recommend that you use a newer version of Kubernetes as a target. Like if you don't do the right things and you use another version, that you may run into errors around validation mismatches.
I guess that could be a partial solution, but if I create a resource that validates against my existing set of member clusters, I have the validation available and I run it before I accept those resource types. But then in the future, are you saying for an upgrade, I have to revalidate everything for the new version? It seems really problematic. Sure.
Yeah, that's a good question. And here's another little wrinkle that I think I'm just riffing off of what you brought up, Maru, is like, say, we have this contract that API types in Kubernetes are not going to have backward incompatible changes made to them. However, I think in practice, that's about 95% true. What happens when there's at least through human error, for example, what happens when a backward incompatible validation sneaks in and you upgrade, for example, you were to upgrade the common federated APIs, and now you have objects that wouldn't pass validation. How are we going to handle that?
User reports.
Yeah, I think this is an important thing to get right. It's probably worth sitting down and thinking about, all the different scenarios where validation mismatches could arise. And for each of those scenarios, thinking through how would we handle this one And probably for each of them, there's a combination of, user education and then potentially software solutions to them.
I think I don't know that there's a tremendous amount of value in putting a lot of upfront work into this, because I don't know that we can necessarily anticipate what's really going to hurt users. Like what are going to be like, oh, whoops, I forgot something, or oh no, this is like really a problem for me. And so in terms of prioritizing effort, I would say this would be a low priority in the near term until users actually start encountering problems and we have an understanding of what the scope of the problem is and how severe it is.
Yep,
Yeah.
agree.
I do need to, I do have to have some solution to this problem, like in the service catalog area. So that is fairly important, and I won't say urgent to solve, but it's something we need a solution for the pod preset thing, which is out of scope relative to this conversation.
At least that's like,
so
it's a constrained problem, at least. Like,
it is a more constrained problem. I'll feedback whatever progress we make on solving it into this group. So, because I think that we're essentially talking about the same problem.
agreed.
Yeah, okay, great.
Thanks for bringing that up, though, Shashi. I think that's really important to have in mind, even if we don't have an immediate solution.
Yeah, agree. Yeah.
Actually, there are a couple of other unsolved similar problems which are sort of carried over from V1 also. I think we need to set aside some time to maybe at least talk about them. And for example, like we chose for this that yeah, we need to keep this in mind, but maybe tackle in future. So
Do you want to maybe enumerate those and we can discuss them on Wednesday?
yep, I can list down in the agenda of the next meeting notes.
Perfect.
Okay, it sounds like we're at time now, unless someone has something super quick they want to bring up.
Yeah, it's 11 already. I mean, 10:30 for you guys. So see you in the next meeting.
Sounds like we'll see each other on Wednesday.
Yep.
Thanks
all right.
all.
See you,
Bye-bye.
everybody.